My mom and dad knew this man who, as my dad's words were, used to be such a loser. Now he's so successful. And I wonder what happened to him. And all he was buying properties, fixing them up and flipping them in Orange County, California in the 1970s, like 1977. And the market was exploding. So he was doing very well. So he was very efficient in his workforce to move things. And so he always hired a high school student. And I'd been 5'1" in my sophomore year, and I got a tumor in my brain. No one knew that's why. And I grew 10 inches in a year. So I was like, get that big strapping guy. We'll do this. So I come and I'm a hard worker. And after 2 days of working my guts out, he's like, you're the hardest working guy I've ever met. He goes, I'm really impressed. Let me take you to lunch. So he takes me to lunch and he starts asking questions. I said, I want to ask you some questions. I said, my dad, and I wasn't trying to be harsh or funny. It's just when you're a kid, you just don't realize. So I said, my dad said you should be such a loser. Now you're so successful. Like, how'd you do that? He was taken back, obviously. So Dad said, what? And he goes, it's probably pretty accurate about me. I said, well, what changed you? And he said, I went to a seminar. And I never even heard the word seminar before. I said, what's a seminar? He said, it's where a man who has become incredibly successful over decades takes all he's learned in the decades and tries to compress it into a few hours or a few days and save you all that trial and error learning. So how long is the seminar? He goes, it's 3.5 hours. I said, well, how much is it? And he said, $35. It'd be like $250 in today's dollars, right? Inflation. And I was making $40 a week. So I said, wow, that's expensive. I said, can you get me in? And he's like, yeah. But you say anything more? And I said, well, will you? And he said, no. And I said, well, why not? And he said, well, because you won't value it if you don't pay for it. I said, no, I'm on my own. I've been sleeping in my car. I'm working as a janitor. I'm telling him the whole story, right? He goes, I don't hear the story. He said, if you're really committed, you'll go there. Or he said, learn on your own experience and take 10 or 20 or 30 years or maybe never figure it out. And then Jim Rohn, years later, I spoke at his funeral. He's a beautiful man. He would start his seminars and say, every time I get up here, I want to do a good job because you never know who's in your audience. And he'd tell the story about this kid who's sitting in his room and shouting out answers. And he goes, it was Tony Robbins. And today he serves people all around the world. And then he also would tell a story about Mike, the two guys that were the most broke, because we probably applied it as much or more than most people would. So that's where my whole start began.